Hello, everyone. I'm Rita McGrath. You probably knew that. And while we are all gathering you up, please do remember the session is being recorded. So don't say anything you don't want your mother, significant other, or siblings to find out about. We will be monitoring the chat throughout. We'll take questions if there's time from the chat. If we don't get to your questions live, we'll try to follow up with some responses later on. My guest this week is John Hagel, author of many books, most recently a book called The Journey Beyond Fear, which I'm going to ask him to talk about, talking about how we can be thinking about a world characterized by a phrase that he really coined called the big shift. So John is a longtime academic, author, thinker, and most recently the head of the Deloitte Center for the Edge, which is one of the leading, I guess, think tanks, you'd almost say, of kind of figuring out what's happening in the world around us. And as I always like to say, you have to get out to the edges to understand that world. So John, thank you so much for joining.
I appreciate the opportunity. I'm a big fan of yours, and it's great to have a conversation. Thank you.
Oh, I've been looking forward to it. So, before we get into the latest work, I think it might be interesting for people to hear a little bit about your journey so far, which, you do talk about it in the book as sort of the precursor to how you landed at this spot. So tell us a little bit about where did John come from and what have you worked on since then?
Wow. Well, I'll start with my childhood because that's where my book starts. I grew up in a different country every year as a child, and unfortunately, I had a dysfunctional family. My mother had huge anger issues and would go into these tirades. And so I grew up in an environment of fear, a lot of fear. And my journey has been to over many decades attempting to overcome it. I ended up, I made a journey when I was still in college. I spent a summer in the Bay Area. I loved the Bay Area, and I decided someday I was going to find a way to live there. And about 40 years ago, I was actually working with Boston Consulting Group, BCG in Boston. And I had this idea to start a computer startup. And I said, what better reason or time to make the move to Silicon Valley? And I made the move and haven't looked back. And part of what attracted me to Silicon Valley was the sense of optimism and opportunity that I found out here. Everybody out here was focused on the incredible opportunities to change the world and excited about the opportunities. And I found that gave me energy and excitement myself, helped to feed my excitement. And so I've done 2 tech startups out in Silicon Valley. For those who can remember that far back, probably my proudest achievement was to be a senior executive with a company called Atari.
The game guys.
The video game business, for sure. And then I spent 16 years as a partner with McKinsey and Company, helped open up their Silicon Valley office, started their e-commerce practice back in 1993. Mm-hmm. And most recently, as you mentioned, I was leading the Global Research Center, the Center for the Edge. And the charter for that was to identify emerging business opportunities that should be on the CEO's agenda, but are not, mm-hmm. and do the research to persuade them to put it on the agenda. Mm-hmm. So it was in your, frame, looking around the corner to find the opportunities that, mm-hmm. That hadn't yet been seen. And so that was very exciting. But I retired from Deloitte last year because I was anxious to finish this new book. It's been 3 years in the making.
Wow.
And finally got it completed and came out in May. So
that's fantastic. Well, congratulations. It's always nice to see it between 2 covers, isn't it? So this is the book, Journey Beyond Fear. Terrific read. So before we get to the new book, though, I'd like to just explore a little, because you are so iconic, in the evolution of Silicon Valley, in the our understanding of what the internet was. I mean, you were talking about, connected refrigerators when people still thought that was an insane idea, right? And you wrote a couple of books that were at least influenced my thinking. And I'm thinking here of net worth and net gain, talking about the power of these connected networks. And it was really well before that was, ordinary. Like, I remember back in the day, like being able to send an email, like over AOL was like a revolution. Remember, like the movie You've Got Mail? I mean, that was like the big thing the net was going to bring. And you basically said, this is just the beginning, and wrote significantly about that. So maybe talk a little bit about those early days, because I think that is fascinating history.
Yeah, no, again, I was looking ahead and seeing the potential of these networks to connect people. The first book that I wrote about the internet was Net Gain, which came out in 1996. And it was really anticipating the opportunity, and I was addressing this from a business context, for companies to organize what I described as virtual communities, bringing customers together, business partners together, but creating communities online where they could interact with each other and develop deeper relationships with each other. And I still view that as a significant, largely untapped opportunity. There are some virtual communities out there that companies are running, but it's still, in my view, much more to be developed there. And then the second book was Net Worth that you mentioned, which came out in 1999. And that one was focused, again, I was trying to look ahead on the whole issue of privacy as the internet and digital technology is capturing more and more of information about us. What kind of opportunity did that create? And I was viewing it, again, a bit around the corner, because everybody was, at the time, was focused on, okay, how do we capture data to do more targeted marketing to our customers and generate more revenue for us? And I was looking at it from the viewpoint of the customers. And I was saying that, some people were saying that we just wanted to be completely anonymous, but my view is very few of us really want to be totally anonymous. We're very willing to share data about ourselves if we're getting value in return. And the challenge, I think, the reason privacy is becoming more of an issue was because people were sensing they weren't getting value in return, that the information was being used for the benefit of those who captured the data. And so going on, but the whole focus of Net Worth was the untapped opportunity to create what I called an infomediary, which was a trusted advisor that would work with the customer and manage the customer's data on their behalf and make it available only to those parties and only under those conditions where the customer would get value in return. And I'm not talking about monetary value. I mean, some people interpreted me as saying, oh, you're going to get paid for access to your data. No, I don't view that as the big opportunity. The big opportunity is value to the customer in terms of providing them with things that are really meaningful to them and useful to them, and helping them to achieve more in terms of what they were trying to achieve. So anyway, those were the two big opportunities. I think there's still largely untapped opportunities and more to come.
Yeah, I would totally agree. In fact, this morning's New York Times has a front page article about the fact that the targeted advertising model is being, I think the phrase they used was being slowly dismantled. And I've written about this too, because to me, the big issue with all this data scraping and gathering and so forth is that it's being done in the dark, basically. And Apple has been the company that has sparked a bit of this change, because they've suddenly made it visible to people and given them permission to opt out of all that data gathering. And that has, I think, created an entirely new conversation around, and I think you're right. I mean, I would love an infomediary to kind of stand between me and all of this kind of carry on about every single thing that being sort of recorded. The one that baffles me is robocalls. Like if Google can know where I am every second of the day, why do we still have these calls going on all day long?
Oh my God. Yeah.
Terrible. So, but just back to the past, just for a minute, before we move on to today. Among the things that you did that I thought were really interesting is you figured out for organizations what all this connectivity meant for really different ways that organizations needed to operate. This notion of small opportunities, taking small steps. You talk about, you should think in 20-year terms or 12-month terms, and everything in between is kind of not that useful. I thought that was a very interesting observation. But things like working on cost, flattening the structure, changing the hierarchy. I think we're even now, a lot of companies are still don't get it.
Oh, absolutely. No. Again, I view ourselves as in the early stages of a big shift. I think it's actually been going on for decades, but we're still in the very early stages, much more to come. And companies, I think, and institutions in general, I don't think it's just companies, but governments, media, universities, all institutions are going to face a huge challenge in fundamentally rethinking what they need to do to create value in this new environment. And yeah.
So let's pick up on educational institutions near and dear to our hearts. And what are some of the things, if you were having a heart-to-heart with a university president, let's say, what are some of the things you'd be advising them to have on their agenda?
Well, I think the whole, it's a complex and broad topic. I think that part of it has to do with the notion of, in the university mindset, it's largely the certification and program mindset. You go to school for a certain number of years, you get a degree, job done, graduate, move on. I believe we're in a world of accelerating change where learning never stops. And if you're truly committed to helping people learn, it's not for 4 years or 2 years or whatever, it's for a lifetime. And how do you rethink your programs to become what I call trusted learning advisors, where you're really focused on the individual? Again, it's not the standardized, here's the program around biology or economics or whatever, but here's, given your particular interests and needs and excitement, here are the things that are going to be most helpful to you in continuing to learn. Mm-hmm. And then connecting people with each other. I think, again, another big issue in learning, particularly as we're talking about creating new knowledge, is how do we connect with others so we can learn together versus just, sitting and listening to a teacher and taking good notes.
Right. Well, so much of what I certainly see in the learning space is people definitely peer-to-peer learning. If I look at, for many of my contemporaries, but as you go even younger, what's your first go-to source to learn how to do anything? It's YouTube, for sure, right? And it's peer-to-peer learning, I had to, all kinds of trivial tasks, from trimming tomatoes to changing the battery in your car key. And, you go to the manual and it's like this incomprehensible hieroglyphics, but right. You go to YouTube and, Ted will show you how to change your car key fob, it's just much more accessible.
Yeah, the issue too, I think, is, again, those are all about sharing existing knowledge. How do I access knowledge that's already out there versus how do we create new knowledge together? How do we, when we're confronting situations that nobody has ever confronted before, how do we learn how to create value and impact in those situations? And that's a very different.
Totally different. Yeah, Martin Reeves, in a book, I think it's a terrific book called The Imagination Machine. He talks about the brain engages in imagination when it confronts something that's different, that it's not seen before, it doesn't have a solution. Yeah. And I think that's just such an interesting observation. It's like when everything's the same, we don't trigger our imaginations.
Sure. Yeah.
So let's dig into the book now. So you talked about your childhood having really created this tension in your mind, but you've been phenomenally successful, obviously, and And what prompted you to write this?
Well, two catalysts, actually, I guess. And I started writing it 3 years ago. The first catalyst was I was trained in my career as a business strategist. I came to believe that strategy was everything. If you have the right strategy, you win. Game over. Over the years, I've come to believe that it's much more about psychology rather than strategy. That if we don't understand the emotions that are shaping our choices and actions, the best strategy just sits on a shelf somewhere. And so focusing on what are the emotions that we're feeling and what's the impact or effect of those emotions. And then the other catalyst was, and again, 3 years ago, I was traveling around the world as part of my work. And everywhere I went, the dominant emotion that I was encountering was fear. At the highest levels of organizations, at the lowest levels, out in the communities, fear was everywhere. And while I think it's understandable, I think there are reasons for fear. I view it as a very limiting emotion and something that we need to move beyond, cultivate other emotions that will help us to move beyond the fear. So that was the
Why
real
don't you focus
catalyst.
on, I mean, there are a lot of emotions one could focus on. There, anger, anxiety, happiness, pleasure. What made you specifically hone in on fear?
Because I guess at a fundamental level, that was the emotion that I was seeing was really driving people's actions over time. And I should qualify that when I talk about fear, I'm not talking about fear of spiders or fear of heights. I mean, we all have fears of different things. I was talking about fear of the future. When we look ahead, do we view the future in terms of threat or opportunity? And I think more and more of us were seeing the future as very threatening. There were things that were going to undermine our current position, if not kill us, and we needed to move beyond. And I would say there are other emotions. I think one of the challenges I face is many people tell me, well, wait a minute, John, I'm not hearing a lot of people talk about fear, at least before the pandemic. My answer is, well, we live in cultures where expressing fear is a sign of weakness. So we're not even willing to acknowledge to ourselves, much less to the people around us, that we're afraid. That's a sign of weakness. And so we manifest it in terms of other emotions. One of the big ones right now, I think, is anger. That we're seeing more and more anger. But if you really go underneath and probe as to what's driving that anger, my belief is it's more and more driven by fear. But anger is a strong emotion that gives us strength, and we can express it without challenge. And then there's also anxiety, stress. I mean, there are a lot of other emotions that come in, but that ultimately are, I think, shaped by the fear as the foundational emotion.
That's fascinating. So how do you define fear? Do you have a definition that you like?
No, I think it's just, are you concerned about the future? I mean, are you afraid of the future? Again, I don't have a real definition, but I focus on what's your view of the future. Are you embracing it, excited about it, or are you running away from it, trying to hide from it? Afraid of it. So.
I mean, one of the things I've observed, and this was true well before the pandemic and continues to be, I think, almost accelerated by the pandemic, is when people are faced with uncertainty. And, you and I have lived through decades in which competitive advantages have gotten shorter, traditional concepts of strategy are being questioned, people are asking, does it make sense to even talk about industries anymore, for example, a very popular idea in conventional strategy. And so this accelerating pace of everything. And I find a lot of people really do respond fearfully to that. It's uncertainty and it makes them anxious. And so what they try to do is go to almost artificially create certainty by doing things that are fundamentally dysfunctional. So, instead of saying, well, I don't know what the answer is, let me run an experiment, they say the answer has got to be this. And then they drive their whole business and decision-making toward that when they actually have no data whatsoever. And one of the things I try to tell corporate people that I'm working with these days is, you don't know. Back in June, remember how we were all going to go out and party and the pandemic was behind us and it was going to be great and people were setting up conferences and here we are now and it's September and there are huge question marks over everything. And that wasn't supposed to happen that way, right?
Yeah, well, and again, one of my challenges is I think many people are saying, well, this is just the pandemic. When the pandemic goes away, the fear will be gone and we'll all be excited again. And again, I started writing the book 3 years ago, well before the pandemic. Fear was everywhere. I don't believe fear is going to go away when the pandemic goes away because there are fundamental forces I describe in the big shift. I mean, you mentioned, intensifying competition around the world, intensifying competition, both at the level of institutions, but also at the level of individuals. The big question in many people's mind is, when is the robot going to take my job? And by the way, if the robot doesn't take my job, maybe a worker from a lower income country will be taking my job. So there's fear because of competition, accelerating pace of change. Things we thought we could count on are no longer there. Oh my God. And then extreme events come in out of nowhere and disrupt your best laid plans. And, so the comment, again, I think the fear is very understandable. I don't think it's irrational or, just crazy. There are reasons for the fear, but it's very limiting. I think the natural reaction we have when we have fear is we tend to shrink our time horizons. We just focus on the present. We can't afford to be distracted by the future. We become very risk averse. We don't want to take any risk. We become less trusting of others because, who knows, they might turn around and do us bad. So I'm just going to do this all myself. It's very isolating. And so it's again, very limiting. And I think it's really unfortunate that more and more of us are being consumed by fear.
Well, and you see that in the social narrative. So if I were to look at, 1960s America, for all of its issues with social justice and whatnot, you had this kind of compact between companies and the people that there'd be loyalty and that loyalty would be repaid, and that companies were situated in communities and there was an obligation to look after your community and so forth. And as we kind of saw the Milton Friedman revelation and as income inequality began to expand, a lot of that in turn fed to mass layoffs, which first became a thing in the 70s. For that, if you were a CEO and you had a mass layoff, that was sort of like you wouldn't be welcome at the country club. That was not okay. Right. And it became kind of legitimized. And I think the whole issue of massive numbers of jobs going off to places like China, I think there was a lot of people experienced that the social order that they had come to take for granted was no longer doing what it should. And then if you talk about competition at an individual level, so if companies aren't going to be loyal, right, I'm not going to be loyal in return. And so now it's like every person against themselves. And it creates a recipe for real sort of social dislocation.
No, absolutely. I think it's leading to more and more dysfunctional societies in general. And it's, again, even though it's understandable, I believe that we all need to find ways to cultivate emotions that will help us to move beyond that fear.
Right. So you talk about that in the book. You talk about narratives, passion, and platforms as a way of beginning to think of an antidote to this sort of fear-laden, deer in the headlights kind of existence. So maybe take each of those in turn and tell us a little bit about what you learned.
Wow. Yeah, the challenge for me is I use each of those three terms with a very different meaning than most people do. So when everybody hears narrative, they say, oh, you're talking about stories. No, I think there's a significant distinction that could and should be made between stories and narratives. So at a very high level, stories are self-contained. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end to them, the end. And they're about me, the storyteller, about some other people, real or imagined. They're not about you. You can use your imagination, figure out what you have done, but not about you. Narrative, in contrast, for me, is open-ended. There is no resolution yet. There is some kind of significant threat or opportunity out in the future. Not clear whether it's going to be achieved or not. And the resolution of the narrative hinges on you. It's a call to action to say your choices, your actions are going to help resolve how this narrative plays out. And I talk about narrative at many different levels. I believe we all have a personal narrative, even though very few of us have even articulated it to ourselves, much less reflected on whether it's the best narrative for us. I think there are corporate narratives. There could be corporate narratives. I think there are actually very few. Regional or geographical narratives, and then movement narratives. And I think across the board, the key is in the personal side, just reflecting on narratives, because again, my experience is most of us have increasingly embraced a threat-based narrative. When we look ahead in the future, it's very threatening, it's very worrisome. And we're not giving a call to action to others to help us because we can't afford to rely on anybody else. It's all got to be us. And so we become very isolated. And I think just the process, in my experience, certainly for me personally, as well as others I've worked with, the exercise of articulating that narrative and then realizing that it is extraordinarily limiting and focusing on what's an opportunity out in the future that really excites me, that really could, fulfill me. And how can I call others to help in addressing this big opportunity?
I love the idea of it not being just a lone activity.
Yeah, no, for sure. And yeah.
One of the exercises I do with people when it comes to personal narratives is I have them draw a lifeline, which is sort of, I was born, and then this happened and this happened and this happened, and how the events that happened left you with something. So it left you with a learning, left you with a principle, left you with something that shaped you. And I find when I do that with my participants in class, just that exercise, going through your lifeline and saying, what are the things that happened to me that shaped how I look at the world, has been enormously revealing. And what I find interesting about that is, you don't have to pay a therapist to do that. You can kind of do that in the comfort of your living room. And I think it's a worthwhile, for our listeners, I think it's a very worthwhile thing to do as you reflect on your personal narrative.
Well, but again, I would make the distinction, because what you're talking about is your personal story.
Right.
It's looking in the past. It's ended. It's where we are. How did we get to where we are right now? Mm-hmm. And it's all about us. And so again, I think the personal narrative I'm talking about is, what's your view of the future? Mm-hmm. When you look ahead, what's really motivating you and driving you? And I think that's also, I think that looking in the back in time can be very helpful, as you said. But I find that looking ahead and realizing, oh my God,
Can you give an example?
So, an example of,
like, what would be a galvanizing narrative?
Oh, well, it's again, it varies depending on who you are. Ultimately, it ties to this other concept of passion, but it's really finding what really excites you. It could be anything from, gardening to technology to, helping address hunger around the world. It's just, what is it that when you think about this and when you do something in this area, you get super excited and you want to have even more impact in that area? Mm-hmm. And what's the big opportunity that could motivate others to come together with you and help you do that? So.
I love that it's a collective idea. One of the, I recently joined the board of our local theatrical arts organization. And there's a whole group of us kind of trying to rethink what does that mean? And we're really contemplating going from this very static, like a factory model, we produce 5 shows a year and they're all the same and they all have the same budget, to much more of a interactive flow kind of model, and really trying to reimagine what live theater could be like, or what live performance could be like. And it's simultaneously totally exhilarating because it hasn't been done before, but it's also making a lot of people super nervous because they're like, well, hang on, if we don't have 5 shows a season and the end of the season, and if all this isn't defined yet, how do we intelligently plan?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the second one's passion, as you mentioned. I don't know if you want to say any more about that.
Yeah, well, I'll actually just one other comment about narratives, just because I think it applies at many different levels. I talked about geographical narratives, and one of the things that people, I've been in Silicon Valley for over 40 years now, and people ask me, well, how do you explain the success of Silicon Valley over so many years? And, and other people talk about universities, talk about venture capital, all these things that are out in Silicon Valley. I believe what's really driving the success of Silicon Valley over so many decades is a compelling and inspiring narrative, regional narrative, which is broadly, we now have technology that can help us to change the world for the better. But you have to come if you want to change the world. It's not going to happen by itself. You need to come here. And it's the reason why most of the successful entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley were not born in Silicon Valley, or not born in the United States. They came from all over the world, drawn by this powerful opportunity-based narrative. And I think that's what explains the success of Silicon Valley. Venture capital, universities, all that helped, but that was what drew people here. Anyway.
I think you're right. No, I think that feels right. And I think one of the other things, and Steve Blank talks about this a lot, is the Silicon Valley as being one of the few places where there was this ethos of, pay it forward. So, if you were a successful entrepreneur and then a young, person came to you and said, I've got this idea, whatever, that it would be very common for older, more established people to be mentoring younger people, to be writing introductions, to be opening up doors for them. And that was part of what was taken for granted as how we do things around here in the Valley.
Yeah.
I thought that was just a really interesting observation on his part, that then became, the way that you learned. And back to learning, right? The way that you learn to build a new company was by, this intense learning from people who built companies before.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's complicated. There are a lot of factors at work, but again, to me, the inspiring opportunity is what drew people here from all over the world. And
so that would be a regional narrative.
A regional narrative, right? You can have city narratives, regional narratives, national narratives. But I think, again, very few do have compelling or exciting narratives that can help bring people together in an opportunity-based way.
I love that. I think that's great. I had some guests on the show, Peter Bornstein, who is developing this constructive journalism network, and making the point that you make, which is, when was the last time you picked up the paper and you read the headline, 150,000 people were lifted out of poverty yesterday. You don't hear that, right?
Right. No, I think, and again, also I somewhat controversially hold our political environment at issue here, because I believe certainly in the US, on both sides of the spectrum, we've fallen on threat-based narratives. The enemy's coming to get us. We're all going to die. We need to mobilize now and resist, or we're going to die. It feeds the fear, And again, I think it's unfortunate that I don't see politicians in general, articulating what I call opportunity-based narratives. What's a really inspiring, exciting opportunity that if we all came together, we could accomplish amazing things. I think that, there was, I think, a comment in the Q&A or chat about, that we're designed for fear as biologically, the amygdala, that's a natural human thing. I believe, yes, we have the propensity to fear, but at the same time, I ask people, well, who have you encountered who aspires to live in fear? Who has an aspiration to be in fear? I think we all have a hunger for hope and excitement. We all have that hunger within us, and it needs to be fed. And the people who feed it, in passing, the last politician that I think really did something in this regard was Obama in his first presidential campaign. Articulated this narrative around hope and opportunity, and got huge response. And I think over time, as he served in the presidency, he lost that narrative. But He got consumed by the establishment narratives. And so I think that that's, again, an untapped opportunity is to feed that hope and excitement that people aspire to.
Do you think it's easier to do threat-based stuff? I mean, that's the impression I get, which is, it's like the red meat dangling, right? And what I'm concerned about is I think that takes place in an increasingly fragmented, and you've written about this as well, an increasingly fragmented information environment, right? So, I'm getting my adrenaline going because some commentator has said stuff that, gets my dander up. And is that just easier? I mean, does it sell? I guess it sells more eyeballs. It sells more advertising than, as I said, the positive newspaper headline, which is, there were absolutely no gun murders, in town last week. You just don't hear about that stuff.
Well, it becomes, unfortunately, a very vicious cycle. The more there's fear in the environment, the more we want to hear about the last great, terrible thing that happened in the world. Mm-hmm. And so that's what sells newspapers. But I think, again, we all have a hunger for hope and excitement, and nobody's paying attention to that. And I think it's an untapped opportunity that someday, will be addressed.
Do you see that at a corporate level as well? I mean, we're hearing a lot now about younger people, especially. They want to join a place that has a purpose. They want to join a place that shares their values. They don't want to be, treated like sort of badly performing robots. They really want to be recognized for what they can bring to the party. So you do see kind of green shoots at the business level of a change in, perhaps a change in people's expectations of what companies are doing.
Yeah, bottom up, I think. Yes, one of the things that gives me hope, I'm an optimist by nature, is what's coming to be called the Great Resignation, which is that more and more people are using the pandemic experience to step back and reflect on, is this really meaningful to me? Is what I'm doing, what I'm spending my time on really meaningful to me? And finding out, no. They were doing this because of fear, because it was the job that paid well or whatever, versus no, this is what really excites me and gives me meaning. And now they're resigning, they're leaving, searching for something that gives them that excitement. Mm-hmm. But
I've been very interested to see the kind of corporate titans, you go out and you say, everybody's going to be back in the office, damn it, and the employees are kind of going, not so fast. And I always joke that, the office, if you're a CEO, the office is an awesome place to be, right? I mean, everything's there. You press a button, someone brings you coffee, the elevator comes to, your floor when you decide you want to move somewhere. It's great. It's totally different than if you're sitting in a cubicle farm with headphones on. So maybe focus enough to get a bit of work done. It's a very different thing. And I do think we're seeing the seeds of something I'm very optimistic about, which could be a recognition that we just have way too many terrible jobs, certainly in this country, in various parts of the world, that, jobs that don't pay well, that have unpredictable hours, that don't provide any sense of building wealth or a solid foundation. And I'm encouraged that maybe that there is now this tension around I'm not just staying here because I get a steady paycheck anymore. Like kind of what's the worst that can happen? I'll leave. And I'm wondering if that's going to change the mindset of employers a bit.
Well, I think ultimately it will have to, for sure. And I want to use this as a trigger to get back to passion, because in my view, ultimately, that's what we all need to search for and find, is a very specific form of passion. Again, my experience is we all have different definitions, different meanings for passion. Based on the research that I've done, I've ended up focusing on a passion that I call the passion of the explorer. And it comes from looking at people who are in environments where there is sustained extreme performance improvement. Mm-hmm. The common element that I found in all those environments was these people had a very specific form of passion. And it has three components to it. One is this notion of that you have a long-term commitment to being in a domain and having more and more impact in that domain. That's what excites you. That's what is motivating you. Then you also, people with this passion, when they're confronted with unexpected challenges, they get excited. Their reaction is, oh my God, this is an opportunity to have even more impact. How could I address this? And then the third element, and I think these are all equally important, is they have what I call a connecting disposition. When confronted with those unexpected challenges, their first reaction is, who else can I connect with who can help me get to a better answer faster? Mm-hmm. And I think these people are going to be the ones that really create impact in the big shift world. Those are the ones that are going to be excited about opportunities. And I think we all have within us the potential for that passion. Most of us, I did a survey actually of the United States workforce, the entire US workforce. And my finding was that at best, only 14%, 14% of US workers have this form of passion. 86% do not. And I don't think that's an accident. I think starting with schools, by the way, we were taught to just focus on listening to the teacher, take good notes, show that you memorized. If you have passion, pursue it out on the playground or at home, but don't bring it into the classroom. We need you to pay attention and just listen. And it was to prepare us for the work environment. To your point, the work environments that we've created, I call it the scalable efficiency model. It's all about tightly specified tasks, highly standardized. It's the process manual. Just follow the manual, do the job as predicted and forecast. Passionate people are deeply suspect. They ask too many questions. They take too many risks. They deviate from the script. Who wants that? Again, if you have passion, pursue it at home as a hobby, but don't bring it into the work environment.
That's so sad, isn't it? When you think of it. Yeah. I mean, really, so Gary Hamel talks about this and he says, look around you. I mean, there are people on Instagram with millions of followers. There are people creating entirely new worlds in the world of gaming and apps. There are people, who are YouTube stars who have mass market followings. He said, and yet you take those same ingenious, passionate people and stuff them into an organization. And it's like, as you said, who wants that? You're creating too much trouble, too much chaos.
No, but I think, again, with the Great Resignation, my sense is that certainly from the people I talk to, that they are finally seeing a need to find that passion and to pursue it in their work, not just as a hobby outside, but make it their work. How can they earn an income from? Yeah. Yeah.
That's so sad, though. 14%?
14%. I think it's actually impressive that 14% of us have managed to hold on to that passion in spite of all the pressure to leave it at home.
Fascinating. So what does that mean for management, let's just say? Because one of the things I've been exploring is something that a colleague calls the permissionless organization. And Jeff Bezos is very famously quoted as saying, even well-intentioned gatekeepers slow things down. And so is the future likely to be people really pursuing passionate work within a guidelines, or where do you see management sort of fitting into that?
Well, that's a whole conversation in its own right. But I would say one of the key elements of this big shift that I'm describing is in the institutions that have been successful in the past, the mark of a strong leader is the one who has the answer to all the questions. No matter what question, you can count on the leader to have an answer. And by the way, if they don't, maybe it's time to get a new leader that does have the answers to all the questions. I believe that in the future, in a world of more and more rapid change, where learning becomes central to success, the mark of a strong leader is the one who has the most inspiring questions and who will freely admit they don't have an answer and ask for help. Can you help me? If we could come up with an answer to this question, we could accomplish amazing things. And I think, to your point, that kind of leader can help to trigger and draw out passion on the part of people. If it's a really exciting question and opportunity that's been identified, wow, yeah, this is exciting. Let me join in. How could I help?
I've seen firms that actually operate on that principle, interestingly, now that I reflect on it, where they'll have, teams pursuing different things and the teams self-select what they work on. And so the things people are most passionate about sort of rise in the priority list. And that's just an example of something that I have seen work.
Yeah, although again, at least in my experience, that's an extraordinarily limited set of situations.
Yes. I know it's definitely not the norm, but hey, as William Gibson said, the future's already here. It just isn't even distributed yet. Right?
Exactly, it's on the edge.
So bring us to platforms now.
Oh wow, okay. Again, the challenge is everybody talks about platforms. We all know what platforms are. In my view, the platforms that we talk about today fall into two categories. One is aggregation platforms, where the focus is on short-term transactions, helping participants to make short-term transactions. It could be buying and selling products, retail platforms. Another type of platform is social platforms, again, helping people to connect and build relationships with friends, family, larger networks. The platform that, in my view, doesn't exist yet, and again, huge untapped opportunity, particularly in the journey beyond fear, but also as a business opportunity, is what I call learning platforms. And here I hasten to add that most people, when I talk about learning platforms, think I'm talking about Udemy or Coursera or all these video platforms where you can listen to people do courses. No, that's learning in the form of sharing existing knowledge. The learning platforms I'm talking about is helping participants to create entirely new knowledge through action together. If you took as your primary design goal, not just as an interesting side benefit, but a primary design goal to help participants create new knowledge through action together, what would those learning platforms look like? I think there's a huge opportunity there.
And do you see that as sort of flows of interactions and people would dip in and out of these environments? Is that what you're
saying? Well, no. So again, in the book, I talk about, I spend a lot of time on my concept of learning. And a key element, again, if we're talking about creating new knowledge, at least in my research and experience, the best way to create new knowledge is not by doing it alone. It is by coming together into small groups. I call them impact groups, and it's anywhere between 3 to 15 people who develop deep trust-based relationships with each other and who are continually supporting each other on the one side, as you run into unexpected failure or whatever, but on the other side, challenging each other, saying, why aren't we having even more impact? How could we have more impact? And so these small groups, to me, in my view, the learning platforms, the key focus is providing shared workspaces for small groups to come together on a continuing basis, not just come in and out, but you are interacting on a continuing basis with this small group. And then networking, connecting these small groups together so that they can learn from each other more broadly. But I think the core unit is the small group. And I would say this emphasis on small group comes from many different environments. Part of it is my business research of frontline places where you see really extreme performance improvement. I've also looked at extreme sports, everything from big wave surfing to extreme skiing. Small groups become key to driving the performance in those areas. And in movements throughout history, the most successful movements in history have had what's been described as a cellular structure. They come together in small groups and then they connect them into broader networks. But it's striking to me that this comes into play in so many different contexts and environments when you're trying to learn through action how to get more impact. Mm-hmm. That's, yeah.
I love that as a design principle. Kurt Carlson, who was the former CEO of SRI that produced, among other innovations, Siri, he said the secret sauce was a regular, I think it was on a Monday meeting, when everybody working on different projects would come together and their task was to present what they'd learned that week. And the task of all the other people was to ask questions, offer suggestions, offer perspectives, and that was in fact what drove their ability to innovate, much more so than many other structures that one might use.
Yeah, no, and again, I think it has many different dimensions to it, but a key one is on the emotional dimension is that people who have real passion, their instinct is to come together in small groups, and they get really nurtured by that connection. That's what feeds their excitement. I call it in the book the accelerant that will help us to accelerate our impact once we discover our passion. Mm-hmm. Find those small groups and find ways to connect in learning platforms so you can amplify the.
And this could be digital, right? Or does it need to be physical?
It can be digital, but I would say for the small group, in my experience, it's much more successful if it's in physical environment where you're interacting with each other at least on a weekly basis, if not more frequently, coming together because you get to know each other in ways that you just don't get to know if you're online doing it. But then certainly connecting the small groups virtually into larger networks, absolutely a huge opportunity.
And the trust is essential, though, right? If you're going to learn, because when to learn means you have to be willing to say, well, I actually don't have the answer to this particular thing.
Yeah, no, and that's why I think, I go back to the leadership models that I mentioned. I think, everybody talks about the erosion of trust in all our institutions today. Very few people are asking why. Mm-hmm. We all know, trust is eroding. Great. Why? Well, I think one of the key reasons is we have leaders who claim they have the answers to all the questions. And there are two possibilities. Either they have no clue as to how rapidly the world is changing and how much is unknown, or they're lying. In either case, I don't trust them.
Okay.
But a leader who's asking for help, that's expressing vulnerability. That's building trust. I need help. Will you help me? So I think, again, on trust, it's a huge opportunity.
Hugely powerful, hugely powerful. So I don't want us to end without talking about your journey. So you built up this fabulous center on the edge, Deloitte, very well published, very well known. And you turned the corner on that, wrote this fantastic book, Journey Beyond. And now this is my Vanna White moment, but you're starting something new now, and you're inviting others to go on the journey with you. So tell us about that and how our listeners can get involved.
Yeah, no, well, I think it's my passion. The passion of the explorer is the opportunity that excites me. Is this opportunity to create learning platforms the way I just described them? And so my focus is, writing the book is to hopefully motivate enough people to want to search for their passion and pursue their passion. But then I want to create a center that will provide programs to help people on that journey beyond fear. And part of it is, it has to do with these different elements of personal narrative, evolving your personal narrative, finding passion. But then a key element is, as rapidly as possible in this new center, I want to find ways to bring people together into these small groups, impact groups, so they can help each other and support each other, and then create learning platforms where they can connect more broadly. And so that's what's exciting me. I'm very much very passionate about it and seeking help, but certainly a lot to be defined and explored, but that's going to be my next chapter. And I would encourage anyone, I in the book, I actually at the end encourage people to reach out, and certainly would encourage here to go to my website, johnhagel.com, if you're interested in this. And there's a place to just sign up to express interest. And as I move forward on this initiative, I would welcome help and support and find ways to collaborate, for sure.
Have you got any of the impact groups going yet?
No, we've started with some pilot programs, which are more around specific opportunities like the personal narrative or finding your passion. But they've been more just programs to work with people as individuals. And part of it is to help them come together, and some have come together and continued beyond the program, but it's early stages yet, for sure.
That's what I thought. Yeah. But that's what you're going to be building out over the next whatever chapter.
Absolutely.
So for everyone listening, if you do go to johnhagel.com, John's written fabulous blogs on kind of getting even beyond the book on latest thinking, looking at some current events and how they're playing out in light of this framework he's developed. So that's definitely worth a read and a browse. And there's a lot of invitations on the website, ways you can get involved, if you have a little bit of time or if you have a lot of time to kind of participate in this new journey. I think it's exciting.
Thank you. Welcome support and collaboration for sure.
Absolutely. Well, this has been just absolutely fascinating. And I want to be respectful of your time. Are there some thoughts you'd like to leave people with in terms of, let's say, they're kind of frustrated, the pandemic is just wearing on, I just don't feel, a friend of mine calls it sort of languishing. That's the phrase he uses. So how do you go from languishing to this passion of the explorer? Are there some suggestions you can offer?
Well, it's in the book, so I would definitely encourage you to read the book. It's I think that if I have a final comment, it's just I started talking about the big shift in the context of mounting performance pressure, and that feeds the fear and explains a lot of the fear that we're experiencing. At the same time, the same forces in the big shift are creating exponentially expanding opportunity. We can create far more value with far less resource, far more quickly than would have been imaginable a few decades ago. But the interesting thing is that if you're driven by fear, you can't even see the opportunities, much less be motivated to pursue them. So my hope is that people will start to see those opportunities and become excited about them and move beyond fear.
And perhaps the great resignation is opening the door to that.
It is, absolutely.
Well, so, John Hagel, thank you so much for spending an hour. This has been illuminating and fascinating, and I'm sure will lead to a lot more conversation, both on your website and elsewhere. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we will get to the questions we didn't get to online in the chat, and see you next week.